Hello class, this is Chapter 2, Sentencing and the Correctional Process. The learning objectives we're going to cover in this chapter are as follows. We will explain the roles of the court team in the sentencing process, summarize the bail process, pretrial release, and preventive detention, explain what is meant by indeterminate sentencing, identify the various forms of determinate sentencing, describe the role of sentencing guidelines, discuss what is meant by truth in sentencing, and identify the most serious issues in sentencing. Let's talk about the participants in the sentencing process. First, you have the prosecutors who are responsible for bringing the state's case against the accused. They're typically an elected or appointed official. Their fundamental obligation is to seek justice as well as convict. As far as the judges, they are the senior officer in a court of criminal law. The duties of the judge are as follows. In a judge-only trial, they're responsible for the rules, questions of evidence, the verdict, and sentencing. In a jury trial, they're responsible for the rules, questions of evidence, instructions to the jury, and sentencing. And they can either be elected or appointed depending on jurisdiction. As far as the probation staff, before sentencing, they commonly conduct a pre-sentence investigation, and they have a significant influence on the degree of punishment. A pretrial officer serves the primary purpose of recommending defendants for pretrial release. Now let's talk about bail, pretrial release, and preventive detention. First is booking, which is the process of admitting an arrestee or sentenced misdemeanor to jail time. Then there's the bail bond, which is the means, financial or property, used to release a defendant from jail. And then you have the bail bondsman, who is the bonding agent who lends money for a fee to people who cannot make bail on their own. In terms of pretrial release, for those defendants unable to make cash bail, this includes release of the offender's own recognizance, or ROR, unsecured bail, percentage bail, third-party custody, a signature bond, and they're responsible for supervised release. The Manhattan Bail Project is a Vera Institute of Justice program that provides ROR release for eligible defendants, which influenced later bail reform. The Bail Reform Acts of 1966 and 1984 are federal legislation that further spurred the bail reform. Then there is the Pennsylvania Penitentiary, which is preventive detention and retains defendants in jail who are deemed either dangerous or likely to commit crimes while awaiting trial. As far as contemporary jails, these are located in the community under the authority of a sheriff who is an elected official. Now let's talk about imposing the sentence. Concurrent versus consecutive sentences. A concurrent sentence is defined as one or more sentences imposed at the same time and are served simultaneously. Consecutive sentences are defined as one or more sentences imposed at the same time that are served one after the other. As far as the effects of good time, confinement can be reduced for good behavior. Sentencing sanctions can vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and there are various sentencing models. As far as the effects of good time, judges take into account reduction in confinement due to good behavior. As far as sentencing sanctions, sanctions, as I mentioned, are available to judges and vary by jurisdiction. They generally include diversionary programs, fines, probation, intermediate sanctions, confinement in jail, incarceration in a state or federal prison, and the death penalty. The responsibility of the judge is to weigh the costs and benefits to the defendant and society at large. As far as intermediate sentences, these are sentences that permit early release from a correctional institution after the offender has served a required minimum portion of his or her sentence. The primary purpose is an effort to individualize for the purpose of rehabilitation. As far as determinate sentences, these are sentences that impose a sentence for a definite term. Its main forms are flat time sentences, mandatory sentences, and presumptive sentences. Once determined to be rehabilitated, the offender is released on parole. This can be criticized as opening the door to disparity. More than 30 states employ indeterminate sentencing. Continuing with sentencing models, there are determinate sentences where a defendant is sentenced to a fixed term. This is the effect of the determinate sentencing law of 1977. Determinate sentencing reform has been implemented in 12 states. As far as structured sentences are concerned, these are defined as federal and state guidelines intended to ensure fair sentencing by ending the reduction of terms in prison by grants of parole, ensuring that persons committing similar crimes serve similar terms, and ensuring that sentences reflect the severity of the criminal conduct. Then there is presumptive sentencing. These fall under federal sentencing guidelines. The first of 4 states to implement presumptive sentencing guidelines were Minnesota, Washington, Pennsylvania, and Florida. There are about 20 states and the federal government that utilize sentencing guidelines. As far as presumptive sentencing, this is the process in which the legislature sets the penalties for criminal acts. Here's a discussion question for you to consider. Should police officers be held to a different sentencing standard in cases of criminal conduct? Why or why not? As far as corrections are concerned, there was the Sentencing Reform Act of 1984. This provided evaluations of sentencing guidelines. These concerns include complexity, bias, and harshness towards offenders. And there are certain legalities regarding these sentencing guidelines. 2 cases that you need to read about and be aware of are Blakely versus Washington, which was ruled on in 2004, and the United States versus Booker, which was ruled on in 2005. Then there are mandatory minimum sentences. The imposition of sentences required by statute for those convicted of a particular crime with specific circumstances, such as selling drugs to a minor close to a school or robbery with a firearm. As far as the 3 strikes laws are concerned, many states have adopted new prison sentencing rules for those who are repeat offenders. As far as truth in sentencing, this requires offenders to serve at least 85% of their sentences. In regards to truth in sentencing, these are laws that require offenders to serve a substantial portion of their imposed sentence and reduces discrepancy in the actual time served in prison. Here's a question for you to consider. Generally, do you think people in the American criminal justice system get what they quote-unquote deserve? In terms of how people are sentenced, a recent survey revealed that more than 1 million adults are convicted of felonies each year in the United States. About 2/3 of all felons convicted in state court are sentenced to confinement either in prison or jail. The remaining 1/4 are sentenced to straight probation. 36% of convicted felons are also ordered to pay a fine, pay victim restitution, receive treatment, perform community service, or comply with some other penalty imposed by the court. In regards to issues in sentencing, there can be excessive length of sentences which the court will sometimes take into consideration. And there are legal factors that affect sentencing: the severity of the offense, the offender's prior record, the offender's use of a weapon, the offender's use of violence, and or a crime committed for money. There are also contextual factors, including social class, gender, age, victim characteristics, and racial disparity. Here's a discussion question for you to consider. It has been reported that the elderly inmate population has grown dramatically as a direct result of excessive length of criminal sentences. The cost to house and care for the elderly inmates' needs, especially if there are chronic medical concerns, can account for extreme correctional expense. Now, for you to consider, has our quote-unquote get tough on crime laws created a greater strain on society from an economic standpoint? And also, should we consider theories of aging out of criminal-prone behavior and release inmates back into the community at age 65? Continuing with issues in sentencing, there are racial disparities of sentencing. There's a long history of disparity, but it's not perhaps linear. Some crimes, such as drugs, show minorities sentenced much more harshly. Minority defendants receive harsher punishment than if their victims are white, and social status may also influence sentencing. Now, the next question for you to consider is to discuss the pros and cons to the different approaches to sentencing addressed in this chapter. As in every chapter, I always encourage you to make sure that you contact your instructor if you have any questions about anything that was covered here. And also, please make sure that you read about the cases that I mentioned in this particular chapter, and not only from your textbook, but also do some research on your own. Again, thank you as always for your time, and we'll see you for the next chapter.